Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. I've just been on holidays for a few weeks. I'm just back myself last Tuesday. So I'm feeling refreshed, ready to share God's word with you this morning. I'm going to preach to you from Psalm 5. It'd be really helpful if you had that psalm open in front of you. We'll have an opportunity to read the parts of it in Indonesian, so hopefully we're able to get the Indonesian up. James, have we got the Indonesian to see of Psalm 5? We're up. Cool. Thanks, James. Well, having been on holidays, I've been able to watch some sport on TV, which I don't normally do during the year, but able to watch the cricket, able to watch the Australian Open. Has anybody else been watching the tennis over the past 2 weeks? It's been really, really good to watch. For me, I enjoyed tennis. A little bit disappointed that, again, there are no Aussies in the finals. Tends to happen every year at the Australian Open. But I'm pretty happy at how the Ukrainian women have been going. It's very encouraging to see that despite the fact that Ukraine's still in terrible war, Ukrainian tennis players did really well in the Australian Open, so that was really pleasing to see. I wonder what tennis players talk about in the locker room. I wonder what they say to each other. Often you hear the commentators talking about, what's this person like and what are they like in the locker room. It's a common topic of conversation in the commentary team. I wonder if they ask each other about their tennis. I wonder if they ask, how's your practice going? How's your health at the moment? How's your mental health? All that sort of thing. Or, is it just so competitive that they just, they don't want the other players to do well, and so they don't ask them those sort of encouraging questions. You'd think there'd be some, the more mature players, maybe the nice guys on the circuit, maybe they do look out for the other players and ask them those sort of questions. Our church morning tea or our church lunches that we have are a little bit like a locker room, aren't they? We have conversation. We've just done the work, in a sense, of praising God, of meeting with God. We're about to go out into the world during the week to do the work that God has prepared for us. So it's a little bit like a locker room in there, where we're conversing with each other, getting ready for what's ahead. But it's not a competition, is it? We're not in competition with each other. And so we should be asking each other questions. How we're going in various parts of our lives, especially our Christian life. Here's one question. There's a really good question to ask other Christians, and you might want to repeat this in your own conversations over lunch. And that is, how's your prayer life going? How are you going in your prayer? How are your conversations with God going throughout the week? It's not uncommon for people to pray. Even non-Christians tend to pray a lot. I think surveys will tell you that 70 or 80% of people will pray at some time, even though they don't know much about God. But as Christians, God tells us to pray continually. And we know that we want to relate to God throughout the week. So it's really important for we as Christians that we have a healthy prayer life. This is perhaps the most important question that we can ask each other in our conversations after church, during lunch. How's your prayer life going? What are you praying for? How are you focusing on God for an extended period of time? And that's why every January I program a sermon series on Psalms. Just reading through some Psalms and preaching through some Psalms to help us to pray. Because over the history of the church, the last 2,000 years, the Psalms in the Old Testament has been the church's prayer book. It's the way we learn to pray and also the way we learn to sing. So this is the last sermon from Psalm 5, which teaches us how to pray, particularly in times of adversity, when we have enemies who are against us. But even taking the adversity out of it, it's a really useful psalm to look at in how we structure our prayer, how we actually come before God in a thoughtful way, rather than just saying what we're feeling, saying what we're thinking, actually thinking about how we approach God. And we see that David does that in a very structured way in this psalm. So we're going to work through the psalm verse by verse, and we'll understand that structure, and that will help us to pray. Pray together in groups and also as individuals. As I said, if you can maybe it would be helpful if you could get the whole psalm up on your phone, or if you brought your Bible to church this morning. Psalm 5, either in Indonesian or English, or if you happen to speak another language, that's okay as well. The psalm is split into 5 stanzas or verses, and what I'm going to do is work through it using one stanza at a time. So what we'll do now, first of all, is look through the first stanza. Now, I think in Indonesian, so verse 1, is that the first sentence up there, your verse 1? Is that right? So that one says a psalm, a song from David. Is that right? So that's your verse 1. I think the first verse will go all the way up to your verse 4. So the first 3 verses... Sorry, I'm doing this on the run. Perhaps I shouldn't be. But does the psalm go up to 13 or does it go up to 12 in the Indonesian? 12. Oh, now I'm confused. I'm not sure how it works in the Indonesian. Anyway, we'll have a look through the first 3 verses, which ends with laying my request before you and waiting expectantly. So whatever the verse in Indonesian that we get to. So what I'll get you to do is read through that out loud together. I'll start by saying the first word, which is easy for me to pronounce, but then I'll stop, otherwise I'll mash it up. And you can finish reading the first 3 verses. Together. Untuk. Thank you. So clearly David is in a very difficult situation. We're going to learn more about his predicament in the 4th stanza. Might be helpful if we close the door. They seem to be having more fun than us out with the youth. Maybe I'll throw in a couple of jokes. Clearly David's in a very difficult situation, and he's calling out to God, asking God in the first stanza just to listen, to hear him. Several times in verses 1 to 3, he pleads with God to listen, to hear, to consider his request. And so this first stanza is an exclamation of a man who needs God to hear, to pay attention to his problems. You may remember Jesus told a parable about a persistent widow who kept on coming to the judge looking for justice and just wanting him to hear and act upon what she was saying. And that is what Jesus said. That Jesus said that's how we should come to God in prayer and not give up. But David's not just praying to some judge who can change his situation a little bit in this psalm. He calls God my king in verse 2. What he's doing here is reminding God that David is his subject. He's saying, I'm your citizen. I'm part of your kingdom. You are my king. And therefore the inference is that my problem is your problem. because I'm a citizen in your kingdom. And in stanza 2, the next few verses, David goes further along this line of pleading. And here he's reminding God of his own character. And we'll read here the next 3 verses. So not that verse, the next few, starting at the English verse 4. Yeah, that's it. So could you read verses 4 through to 6 out loud, please? Sebab. Thank you. So David is reminding God of his own character, isn't he? He's saying, I know you hate evil. You cannot bear to be in the presence of evil. I know, God, that you are good. So like oil and water, God and evil do not mix. And God actually repels evil from his presence. That is God's character, and is testified to throughout the Bible. God cannot stand to be near evil. Now, those first 2 stanzas, 1 and 2, David asking God to listen, pleading for God to listen, and then reminding God of his character, are the foundation upon which David will build his prayer. But that doesn't come actually until the 4th stanza in verses 9 and 10. David says then that he's being slandered, he's being wronged by his enemy, and he wants his king, his God, to do something about it. It would have been natural for him, after verse 6, to make that request, to go on and say, this is your character, please do this. But instead of that, in verses 7 and 8, stanza 3, David turns his attention onto himself. And he admits that he himself is just a worshipper of God. And we'll read verses 7 and 8 now, please. Thank you. Tetapi. So mostly when, if we're trying to convince someone else to do something, we might say, you owe me. You should do this because I did this for you, because I am such and such a person. Maybe I'm your boss if you're in a work situation, that sort of thing. But David doesn't do that here. Instead, what he is saying, that he's a worshipper of God. In reverence, I bow down towards your holy temple, he says. And it's only by God's great love that David can come into God's house. David knows that he depends upon God entirely. And so he prays in God in verse 8, lead me, Lord, in my righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me. He's saying to God, I don't want to go down the path of evildoers. I don't want to be a person like my enemies, so I'm going to worship you and I'm going to trust in you. So please keep me on the straight and narrow. So he's declaring his humble trust in God. And that is a useful thing to do in prayer. Just to say to God, I can only worship you because of your love, because of your mercy, because of what you have done for me. I'm one of your people. Having declared that humble trust, David then in verses 9 and 10 finally makes his request. And I'll get you to read that I'll read that in English, and then I'll get you to read it again in Indonesian. So he says in verses 9 and 10, not a word from their mouth can be trusted. Their heart is filled with malice. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they tell lies. Declare them guilty, O God. Let their intrigues be their downfall. Banish them for their many sins, for they have rebelled against you. And if you could read that, verses 9 and 10 in Indonesian, please. Sebab Thank you. So the sin of David's enemies, which when he's finally getting to his prayer here, is to lie and to deceive. David's already said in verse 6 that they are sins that God hates. So David's detractors, they don't speak the truth. They are liars. And that's because their hearts are turned against David himself. They're set firmly against him. This reminds me of Jesus' opponents. You know, Jesus was doing lots of good. He was saying wonderful things. Crowds just flocked to him because they wanted to hear his words and get healed by him and freed of evil spirits. So much good Jesus was doing, and yet the leaders of Israel very early on became set against him. So Mark notes in his chapter 3 that the Pharisees held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. They were just completely set against Jesus. Maybe you've had that experience in your life, that feeling, that understanding that such and such a person, or maybe even a group of people, is just against you. It doesn't matter what you try, doesn't matter how much you try and please them, they're just against you. They want you to fail. They speak against you behind your back. They slander you and they work against you. Because of that destructive heart of David's enemies, David says they have death in their throats, verse 9. Their throat is an open grave. When they expel air to speak, it's like poison gas that is designed for David's death. An open grave is their throats. David actually says in verse 9 that they flatter with their tongue. The NIV English has with their tongue they tell lies. I'm not sure exactly what the Indonesian says. But closer to the original is flattery. That idea of someone saying something to your face but not really meaning it. People flatter you when they're trying to gain something from you, so that they might be trying to build you up so that they could ask you for something, or they might be speaking good of you to your face, but then behind your back they say the complete opposite. They're actually working against you. And that's what David's enemies are doing. They're behaving like his friends to his face, but they're plotting his downfall behind his back. I remember once I got a new position in the company that I was working for, and I went to manage a very small team. And some of them were quite experienced, and one lady in particular, you know, she'd been doing the job for 20 years, and I came in brand new. I was in my late 20s, she was in her early 50s, and she sat me down on the very first day, and she said, "Steve, I really think that you're the right person for this job, and I'm 100% behind you." And always to my face, she was very polite and very, she did whatever I asked of her. I didn't realise until a whole year later that actually behind my back she'd been saying all sorts of nasty things. And I remember my boss saying to me, I think this was my exit interview as I left the company, he said, "You know, she really doesn't like you." And it was news to me. I had no idea that she'd been working against me behind my back. And that's the way it works sometimes. Flattery is an awful thing that some people use to cover their tracks when actually they're working against you behind your back. And that was David's situation. So David pleads with God for justice in verse 10. He's found out that these people are working against him. And so in verse 10, which is really what he wanted to ask God, he pleads for justice. He says, "Declare them guilty, O God. Let their intrigues be their downfall. Banish them for their many sins, for they have rebelled against you." Now, when you're faced with some sort of opposition, when there are enemies who are speaking against you or something working against you, even a sickness or a difficult situation in a relationship, evil feels very powerful, doesn't it? It feels like you're really up against it. But in fact, evil is very weak. It is vulnerable. And David knew that it was vulnerable in God's eyes. And he says here effectively that it's vulnerable in three different ways. It's vulnerable to exposure, it's vulnerable to collapse from within, and it's vulnerable to expulsion, being cast out. So firstly in verse 10, David prays, "Declare them guilty, O Lord." Because evil is vulnerable to truth, isn't it? You know, all it takes to uncover a lie is just to tell the truth. It's very vulnerable. And so David prays that God would declare them guilty, speak the truth. Secondly, he says, let their intrigues be their downfall. See, evil is vulnerable to internal collapse. Remember what Jesus said about Satan working against himself? Any kingdom divided against itself will surely fall. Evil is internally unstable because God made the world, didn't he? God made the world to work the way he has planned it to work. And so evil is ultimately self-defeating, especially things like flattery. Eventually it gets found out, doesn't it? And it collapses. Lastly, David prays, banish them for their many sins. David's already said in verse 5, the arrogant cannot stand in your presence. Evil and evildoers will be removed from God and his blessings. And, Jesus said at the end of time that those who do evil will be rooted out from God's kingdom. They will not be able to stand in God's presence. So really, those who do evil, and in particular in this psalm, those who lie and deceive, they're playing on train tracks, aren't they? Eventually, they're going to get hit. They shall be exposed or collapse, and then they'll be cast out from the fellowship of God and his people. And David even adds a reason why God will do this. It's because it is against him that they have sinned. They're doing things to David, but David says actually they have rebelled against you. Verse 10. In mistreating David, they are acting out their rebellion against God himself. Any sinner who hurts themselves or hurts others or hurts God's world is just living out their rejection of God himself. And the king does not take kindly to rebellion. He will not just sit and let people behave that way. So that's David's prayer. We've looked at 4 stanzas so far. He's asked God to hear him. He's reminded God of his character, that he hates evil. And then he's asked, he's reminded God that he himself is just a worshipper. Only by God's love can he come into his temple. So he's humbly come before God. And then his request is for justice. Now it's just a matter of David waiting for the answer. In verse 3 he says, in the morning I lay my request before you and wait expectantly. But he doesn't end the prayer. with verse 10. In verses 11 to 12, he widens his prayer to all people, to all who trust in God, in verses 11 and 12. So can I get you to read that just in the Indonesian? Is okay? Thank you. Thank you. David, if you ended at the end of verse 10, you could read this psalm just as a request for self-vindication, all about David himself. But what he's doing now is saying, I'm not just praying selfishly, I want all people to realise that you are a good God and to rejoice in you. It's a great way to end a prayer, isn't it? God, answer my prayer so that all people might see that you are a God who loves justice. And as a model, Psalm 5 is an excellent prayer. We can look at Psalm 5 and learn very well how to pray. The words themselves convey so much truth. And if you're in a similar situation to David, maybe you're in that situation now where you know you have enemies who are speaking about you behind your back and flattering you to your face, this is a great psalm to pray. To use exactly the same words for God. But really, for any prayer, any request that you make to God, Psalm 5 puts forth an excellent structure. And so I want to go through that structure just briefly again now so that we might learn how to approach God. If you were going to say something to the Prime Minister of Australia, let's say you thought, only Anthony Albanese can do something about this, I need to ask him a question. Would you put time and thought into how you would do that? Or would you just rock up into Canberra one morning and knock on the door and say, I need to speak to Tony? You wouldn't do that, would you? You'd plan it out. You'd think about how you're going to bring your petition before the Prime Minister. And as Christians, we're speaking to the creator of the universe, the one who has billions of people praying to him every day. We need to think about how to structure our prayers so that our prayers are in accordance with God's word. Now, it's true that God's going to hear us no matter what words we use, and we don't have to say particular words for him to hear. That's because he's a gracious God and he loves us. But from our side, we need to be thinking seriously about how we approach God, how we put our petitions before the King, as David does in Psalm 5. Firstly, tell God how much you need him to hear. Say, God, please listen to me. Lord, please pay attention to my prayer. Because what you're speaking out is your heart to really be heard. We really do want to be heard to God. And if it doesn't seem like it's important to us, then maybe God's going to realise that we're not really serious about our prayer. But if we say, Lord, please listen to me, then the Lord will listen. He is our King. We are his subjects. If we're in need, we can go before God and say, God, you are my King. Please listen to my prayers. Secondly, it's very helpful in our prayers to verbalise what we know to be true of God, that is, his character. So before we make the request, we think through ourselves, what is it about God that would mean he's going to answer my prayer? We know that he is a God full of justice, and so David prays this prayer, but he's also full of love. He's full of power. We look at Jesus and we know the character of God. And so if we're in need, if let's say we have an illness, we go before God and we say, Lord Jesus, I know that when the woman who'd been subject to bleeding came to you and just touched the end of your cloak, you wanted to speak to her. You wanted to listen to her. And so please, Lord, listen to me. We take what we know of God's character and remind God of that, as David does here. Try and think of what it is about God that would mean that he would listen to and answer your prayer. As an example, another example, like you, I've been praying for friends, family,